Although laws are made, they don't necessarily have to be followed. This was clear during the 1920s. Major groups like the Ku Klux Klan became dominant during this era. Members of the KKK supported the new law of prohibition. They took actions against all of those who opposed prohibition. However, prohibition was one of those laws that could never really be enforced. As a result, many people broke this law in order to fulfill their desire to drink. Thus, it led to more and more people going to illegal bars called speakeasies to consume alcohol. These bars were located in very rundown areas and were managed by African Americans. This increased the interaction between the whites and the blacks. Additionally, the bars introduced the whites to jazz music. This type of music originated from the blacks, but it soon spread and became infamously popular.
All of these factors, the Ku Klux Klan, prohibition, and jazz music, start to change the relationship between the whites and the African Americans in ways unimaginable. As more changes began to spring in America, the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan was brought about in 1915. This group had the vision of creating a pure white society, eliminating those who were either of an inferior race, religion, or nationality. However, their goal changed in the 1920s. During this decade, the KKK targeted anyone who was against prohibition. Before, they only used to target the immigrants and the African Americans. According to Dr. David J. Hansen, the KKK promised to reform politics, to enforce prohibition, and to champion traditional morality. However, the KKK prioritized prohibition as one of the group's main concerns. Thus, the number of KKK members increased dramatically in the decade for groups that advocated prohibition, such as the women, joined. Even though the KKK was much larger now, the number of people who were against prohibition was still larger. As a result, even when the members of the KKK used violent means to break up speakeasies, people continued drinking alcohol. All in all, although the KKK was considered to be a white supremacist group, it attacked everyone that was against their beliefs, which included the whites. Two opposite races, the anti-prohibition whites and the African Americans, together became one enemy of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s.
Even after the prohibition law was created and ratified, 2/3 of the American population still continued to drink through means of medicine, religion, and clubs. Those who did not fit into any of these categories resorted to obtaining alcohol illegally from bootleggers or speakeasies. Since white-owned bars were more often inspected than African-American-owned, many gathered at black speakeasies and drank there. This was a means by which many whites and blacks started to coincide and form mixed relations. In a few circumstances, such as Virginia in 1924, even the government became concerned about the interracial marriages and therefore created the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. Although both races still disliked each other, as time went on, they both became more tolerant of each other and engaged in relationships. Prohibition made both sides want to fight for a mutual goal, to repeal the law.
Before the 1920s, jazz music was known as the devil's music. It broke both musical and social rules. Hence, it was very different from what people normally characterize as proper music. Just like how hard rock and loud screamo music is considered rebellious today, jazz was considered rebellious in the 1920s. The younger generations rebelled against the idea that classical music was the only form of music. As more people started being introduced to jazz, it became prevalent within society. Although there were still some people, like Thomas Edison, who made fun of jazz, there started to be an increasing amount of people who liked this new type of music. Those that enjoyed jazz simply ignored the derogatory comments that detesters made. Campaigns came about as an attempt to quell the rise of jazz music. Usually, those who tried to suppress jazz were the older adults that were taught to hate anything that was associated with the African Americans. Because of the campaigns against jazz, the African American jazz musicians could only play in places like the speakeasies, where they had to interact with the whites who came there for alcohol. The court even made absurd rulings to stop the spread of jazz, such as claiming that building a theater for jazz near a Cincinnati home for expectant mothers would be harmful for the soon-to-be-born babies. However, the spread of jazz was something that couldn't be stopped. As one critic says,
in 1920, the best thing that could have happened for jazz, they passed the most idiotic law in the history of the United States, prohibition. Well, from a handful of saloons around the country, you now have thousands and thousands of speakeasies.
jazz was so upbeat that people couldn't help but dance. Often there was interracial dancing occurring between the whites and the blacks in these speakeasies. Soon, jazz became incorporated in the traditional American culture. Soon, jazz music became America's music, as it brought people who normally hated each other together.
Due to the actions of the KKK group, effects of the Prohibition law, and spread of jazz music, the relationship between the whites and the African Americans evolved. The societal values went from being conservative to radical. These changes led to the modern view of society that allows interracial marriages amongst other unconventional ideas. Without the 1920s, the society wouldn't be where it is today.